So, as I said already, over these next few weeks, we're going to be thinking about journeying together. Our reading today is about one of the most famous journeys in the Bible. And it's often the first place that people start when they begin to think about mission and the mission and the call of God. The great promise to Abraham comes in Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 3. However, we have a bit of a problem if we start there without referring in any way to what has come before. The whole point of what God initiates with his promise to Abraham only becomes clear when we see it against the background of what has already happened. After the story of creation in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis, we see that things go wrong in chapter 3, where God has looked at creation and said it's good. And when he's looked at human beings and said they are very good, everything goes wrong in chapter 3. They choose to rebel against their Creator, disobeying his authority and disregarding the boundaries that he has set for their freedom in the world. After the fall, men and women can no longer face each other without shame and blame. And even the soil, we are told, comes under the curse of God, and the earth no longer responds to human touch as it was supposed to. Chapters 4 to 11 then combine an escalation of sin, but it does so alongside repeated marks of God's grace. After the flood, God renews his promise to creation and to human beings, and they are once again sent out into the whole earth to multiply and fill the earth. It doesn't take very long, though, until we run into trouble again, because in chapter 11, we discover that there is this human decision to settle and to build a city with a tower that's designed to reach God. That seems to combine a degree of arrogance. It says they wanted to make a name for themselves, but it combines it with a degree of insecurity. They weren't prepared to trust God and to do what God had told them to do. They didn't want to go into the whole earth. So they kept together and they began to build the Tower of Babel. And that story presents us with a people who seem intent on invading heaven while at the same time resisting God's will for them on the earth. And the result of the whole thing is chaos. And it's not clear by the end of chapter 11 exactly where the mission of God is going. Because he's tried wiping them out, all bar one family. He's tried to help them. He's done all. So where is it going? Well, it's quite clear that these problems are not going to be resolved by dealing with sin on an individual basis, but by dealing with sin for all people and removing the curse that is on human beings by destroying death itself. And in fact, it takes the whole of the rest of the Bible for God's plan to be unfolded in a way that we can understand and see what it was and is still to be. Amazingly, God sees an elderly, childless couple and decides to make them the launch pad of his whole mission of cosmic redemption. Not the people we would choose. What talents and skills did they have? They didn't need that because they had God. The call of Abram is the beginning of God's answer to the evil of human hearts, to the strife of nations, and to the groaning brokenness of creation. It's the beginning of the mission of God and the mission of the people of God. Genesis 10 and the first part of chapter 11 focus on the nations of humanity. In Genesis 10, they are beginning to scatter across the earth in order to fill it as they were supposed to. But in Genesis 11, we see that they had come together, they had built this tower, but then they're scattered again. But this time in a state of confusion and division after God gave them different languages so they couldn't understand each other. And it was during, it seems, this second scattering that Terah moved to Haran with his family. The problem is that he started out going for Canaan. He started out to go much further. And he got so far and settled. Genesis 11:31 says, when they came to Haran, they settled there. Imagine then how he must have felt when his son Abraham decides to go on. When he stood there watching him disappear into the distance, how would he feel? Would he feel happy that the journey that they had started out together was going to come to a conclusion? Would he feel angry that he was being abandoned and left behind, even although he had the choice to go? Would he feel frustrated in himself because he didn't have the courage to go? How would he have felt as he saw Abraham and everything that Abraham took with him disappear over the horizon? The Lord said to Abraham, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. All people on earth will be blessed through you." Now, quite often what we do then is we jump instantly to the New Testament, and we say, look, here's Jesus, the one who blesses all people on earth. But that wasn't the call to Abraham. Abraham didn't know anything about that. This blessing for Abraham was to be a blessing to people in his day. It's not for some distant point in the future, or not just for some distant point in the future. So I don't want to leave you with the idea that mission is a New Testament thing, because when we look at Acts, it's all about going out. Before we go too much further, however, we need to think about this blessing and understand that it's not simply a spiritual blessing. Quite often nowadays we think of blessing, God's blessing us as being spiritual. And for example, we have two folks who yesterday discovered something of the blessing of God as God spoke to them and challenged them and encouraged them and helped them. And that's kind of what we think of as God's blessing. Sometimes we might pray that God would bless us with more resources or things like that. But actually, blessing in the Old Testament, and blessing as it should be, is about fruitfulness and abundance and fullness on the one hand, but it's also about enjoying rest and communion with God on the other. It's these two things together. Blessing is set within relationships that are both vertical and horizontal. Blessing is dependent on the relationship with God. It has to be blessed by God. You have to know God. But blessing is also something to be shared in relationship with other people. Vertically, those who are blessed know the God who is blessing them, and as a result, they seek to live in faithful relationship with God. Horizontally, the relational element of blessing reaches out to people round about them. If you continue reading the story of Abram, you find that God did bless him and his family with wealth and possessions, with land. And it was ultimately through the line of Abraham that Jesus was born. The patriarchs knew that the blessings that accompanied them all their lives were wrapped up in their relationship with God. When Abraham's grandson Jacob finally met his own grandsons in Egypt, something he had never expected, he believed that Joseph had been killed, believed that there was no hope, no future for that relationship, and yet God used that very event to bless not only Jacob and his family when there was famine and they got food, but to bless the whole nation of Egypt. Because Joseph rose to be second in command, and he realized, because God spoke to him in a dream, that famine was coming, and they were prepared. And through Abraham, Egypt received a blessing. And eventually Jacob goes down And Joseph is there, and Joseph's children are there. And in Genesis chapter 48, verses 15 and 16, Jacob, who is now blind and very old, says this: "May the God before whom my fathers Abraham and Isaac walked faithfully, the God who has been my shepherd all my life to this day, the angel who has delivered me from all harm, may he these boys. May they be called by my name and the names of my fathers Abraham and Isaac, and may they increase greatly on the earth." There's the blessing from Abraham being transferred down the generations, and still down the generations to you and me even today. That's the relationship, the God relationship. On the other hand, as was said horizontally, there are several instances of other people being blessed through contact with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, with those that God has blessed. And that just reminds us that those who inherit the promise of Abraham are expected to continue to fill God's promise to be a blessing to other people. So when we combine the dark pictures of Genesis 3 to 11 with the promise of blessing in chapter 12, we can anticipate, we can see as we read it now, that the story, the history, the work of God in the world, there's two things going on simultaneously. On the one hand, human sin is all present, and when we look around the world today, we see the consequences of that sin. It's quite clear and quite obvious, even in the world in which we live today. But at the same time, we can see the footprints of God in dealing with nations and dealing with individuals and transforming lives and circumstance and situation. The two go hand in hand, always have and always will. And we see God's footprints of blessing. And we look forward to finding out how it is going to be that He will honor that promise, to see all nations being blessed. From the call of Abraham, the idea of blessing takes on this historical dimension, injecting hope and faith into an otherwise dark and depressing story. And that means that blessing is missional. It is this very promise of blessing to all nations through God's choosing of Abraham that drives forward the mission of God in the world and the mission of God's people that comes from it. At the very most fundamental level, who are these Israelites? Who are they and what are they for? They were intended to be the vehicle of God's mission of extending His blessing to the nations. People were supposed to be able to look at them and in the relationship that they had with God, see something that they wanted, see something different, to be able to see how God had blessed them and kept them and protected them and guided them. They were supposed to be light to the nations, to bring blessing to the nations. And if you read through the stories, you'll see that there are times that they were. When David and Solomon ruled Israel, their boundaries were extended, and they were a blessing to the nations. But then if you continue reading through Kings, what you discover is that there were kings who were utterly evil, as well as kings who were good and followed the Lord. And they went up and down and up and down, and eventually God said to them, "Enough." And they began another journey into captivity, only eventually to be blessed again by God, to be brought back to Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple. And there's that cycle of being blessed and turning away from God and being punished, and repenting and being blessed and turning away. I don't know about you, but I understand that, because that's what I do. So who are we? What are we here for? Well, the answer hasn't changed. We are also to be people through whom the nations are blessed. We are expected to know the God who blesses us and in turn be a blessing to people around us. Generally, the church in the West has had a real problem over the last 150 or so years. We've kind of done what Terah did. We've gone so far and we've settled. One of the biggest contributors to that has been this: church buildings. So much energy goes into the building that sometimes the building becomes more important than the mission. Ask anybody who's ever been through a union. But more than that, the building sets limits, even if they're not expressed. Because when your building becomes full, you don't need to witness. When there's enough people and you've got enough money, you don't need to go out. And mission then becomes something that other people do. And it becomes something that is done away out there and not in here at home. Buildings traditionally are not easy to move. There was a wee story yesterday on the Alpha course about a minister who wanted to move the piano. And to avoid any conflict, what he did was he moved it a foot at a time over a number of weeks until it had gone from one side to the other. Because we don't like change. We don't like doing things differently. We don't like it when our settledness is disturbed. And yet we are called to be a transient people. A people who are on the move. A people who are looking always to see what God is doing next. And it's hard. You see, as society changed, it was okay when people came to church, and that was the expectation. It was okay when that happened, but when society changed and people don't come to church anymore, what we've done in the past no longer is effective, and we have to find a new way of being a blessing to the people around us. And we need to begin to see that mission is not something for people out there. It's not a Sunday service. It's not a summer club. It's something we are expected to do every day of our lives just by being God's people where He's put us. By talking to people, by being ordinary, by being ourselves in relation with God. You see, if we do it our way, we end up with empty buildings and buildings that are not fit for purpose. A building that still takes up time and money. And you might say, hang on a minute, loads of good things have happened over the last 100 years. And yes, you're absolutely right. Of course there have been loads of good things that have happened. Of course there have been. There have been amazing revivals where God has moved powerfully and transformed people's lives. There have been great missionary endeavors overseas. There have been growth in some churches and in many individuals. And of course, there's been some fantastic community service and community work. Of course, there's been amazing things that have happened. Unfortunately, they've tended to be the exception rather than the rule. And so it's into that scenario that the Church of Scotland has, through the Panel on Review and Reform and the Ministries Council, introduced this path of renewal process that we have been accepted for. They've accepted 23 congregations across Scotland. See, essentially we know that the church in Scotland has not been particularly effective at being a blessing to the people around. But we've not been particularly effective at making disciples. For decades, the main operating model has been attractional. It's, we are here, come to us, come and see what we've got on. But we know that that model doesn't really work anymore. It's not as effective at making disciples as it should be. It's not as effective at helping us to engage with the communities that we're called to serve. Because they're not here. We're here, and they're not. It's good for us. So Path of Renewal is then a program for us to think through, what do we do about that? What is this journey that God is calling us to? Where is he taking us? What does he want us to do? How now, in our context, in our community, are we expected to bless other people? It begins by recognizing that there is a real missional challenge in a changing culture. Understanding that the culture outside the church has changed significantly, even over the last 15 years. And the church now finds itself no longer in the center of society, but right on the edge, and nobody really cares what we have to say anymore. Nobody would think of going to the church for help if they were struggling, unless they need food. But it's not the first place that people turn to anymore. And so we need to find a way of reaching out and being a blessing to people. We need to move, to go beyond our comfort zones and reshape what we do. And part of that has to be to remember the call to Abraham and the promised blessing of God, because it's still there, it's still relevant, it's still true. God still wants his people to understand that they are blessed by him and they are expected to be a blessing to others. But how do we do it unless we're where they are? Perhaps the next phase of this journey is to be more focused on being a blessing to people in the way that we live our lives each day, rather than imagining that we can do it all on a Sunday morning in an hour and a bit. It's a challenge, but it's not an insurmountable challenge. How do I know that? Because the God who called and who blessed Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob calls and blesses us. God is the same yesterday and today and forever. One of the last things that Jesus said to his disciples was this: all authority, not some authority, but all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all. Bless you, and I'll be with you, and you are going to bless all nations. And that call is still there. Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything that I've commanded you. And here's the kicker: surely I am with you always. I'm with you. I know it's hard. I know you don't know where you're going. I know you're unsettled. I know you don't like it, but I am with you to the very end of the age. Amen. Our last song is one that just reminds us that when we go